Imagine standing on the edge of a vast battlefield, watching the most fearsome formations of the Waffen-SS roll past you, units so renowned that their names still echo through every major book and documentary on World War II. Among all elite formations, 3 shone brighter than the rest: Leibstandarte, das Reich, and Totenkopf. These divisions spearheaded most German offensives from the opening days of the war right up to its bitter collapse. And now, let us step closer, much closer, to examine each of these legendary formations. Dear friends, if this video has reached you, it's not by chance. Right now, click the subscribe button and the notification bell. Write a number from 1 to 5 in the comments. I will personally respond to the first 50 comments, and make sure to watch the video until the end. The first division in our spotlight is the one considered the crown jewel of the German army, a formation present at nearly every key moment of the war, from its explosive beginning to its grim conclusion: the Leibstandarte. This formation was born in March 1933 with a singular purpose: to become Hitler's personal guard, taking over a role previously held by the SA. At the start, it consisted of only 120 men, but its numbers grew steadily as the years passed. Picture it: a small unit functioning as nothing less than the Führer's Praetorian Guard, complete with unique uniforms, whose most striking feature was the gleaming white belts. The physical standards were ruthless: a minimum height of 1.78 meters, a family lineage stretching nearly 2 centuries back for officers, and exceptional physical and intellectual abilities. These were just some of the requirements for acceptance. By 1935, the Leibstandarte had evolved into a motorized infantry regiment, boasting around 2,700 men. The following year, they took part in the German march into the Rhineland, and soon after, in the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland. Ironically, despite their grueling training, their constant presence in ceremonial events and parades earned them a mocking nickname among some observers: the Soldiers of the Asphalt. Their first true combat test arrived on September 1st, during the invasion of Poland. Under the command of Josef Sepp Dietrich, the Leibstandarte advanced from Breslau toward Warsaw as part of Army Group South. Along this route, they became embroiled in the Battle of Bzura, the most intense confrontation of the Polish campaign. They also took part in the siege of fortifications, guarding the approaches to Warsaw, particularly at Murków, north of the capital. By the end of the campaign, the unit had earned a reputation as a devastatingly effective, motorized shock formation, exactly the kind of tool the German High Command wanted for its style of warfare. Thus, in preparation for the next campaign, the decision was made to strengthen the unit even further. This moment came only months later with the assault on France. For this operation, the Leibstandarte received a second anti-tank company, additional sappers, its own artillery unit, and on paper, a contingent of Stu G3 assault guns. However, when the campaign began, the Stogs had not yet joined the formation. The Leibstandarte's mission was clear: pierce through Holland first, then Belgium, with lightning speed. What followed was a textbook display of motorized warfare, a perfect fusion of daring maneuvers and raw engine power. In just hours, they raced across Holland. First thrusting toward Nijmegen, then crossing the Waal River, and sharply swinging west toward Rotterdam, where they linked up with German paratroopers already on the ground. Once their positions were secured, they surged northward toward Amsterdam at full throttle. In a single day, they covered an astonishing 215 kilometers, appearing everywhere at once and leaving the enemy bewildered. Beyond their battlefield achievements, the Leibstandarte also played a strategic deception role. Their rapid, visible presence convinced French and British forces that this was the primary German thrust, tempting them to rush into Belgium exactly where the Germans wanted them, while panzer divisions slipped through the Ardennes. Yet the unit's mission was far from finished. As soon as possible, they resumed their advance into Belgium and then into France to support the siege of Dunkirk. From there, they swept down through central France toward the vicinity of Lyon, passing near Paris along the way. When the campaign ended, the division had suffered 111 dead and 390 wounded. Sepp Dietrich was awarded the Knight's Cross. Another figure who would become famous later, Michael Wittmann, also served in the unit throughout these operations, at that time commanding a 222 half-track reconnaissance vehicle. By the time of the Balkan campaign, 6 short-barreled Stughi 3 assault guns had finally joined the formation, with one assigned to Wittmann. During the German Balkan operation in the spring of 1941, the Leibstandarte crossed into Yugoslavia on April 11th from Bulgaria, carrying out yet another rapid maneuver that propelled them deep into the Peloponnese and eventually to the city of Olympia. Once this campaign concluded, the formation prepared for the looming invasion of the Soviet Union. Transforming into a brigade of roughly 11,000 men, the Leibstandarte remained in reserve during the early days of Operation Barbarossa. On July 2nd, it was rushed to Army Group South, the slowest advancing of the 3 German groups. First moving toward Kiev, then pushing southward along the northern bank of the Bug River, they reached the Crimean Peninsula and continued their advance along the northern coast of the Sea of Azov toward Rostov. This dramatic drive came at a brutal cost. By mid-November, when Soviet forces counterattacked in the Rostov sector, the Leibstandarte was down to only 35% of its original manpower and a mere 15% of its vehicles. As we saw in accounts of Germany's first major withdrawal on the Eastern Front, the Leibstandarte endured extremely heavy defensive fighting at the end of November, retreating with the rest of the German army to the Mayas River. The winter months brought further horrific losses. The formation fought for months on end, with almost no rest. By mid-1942, shortly before the Great German Offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad, the unit was sent to France to recover and rebuild this time as a Panzer Grenadier Division. There, it was re-equipped with the newest long-barreled Panzer Force and the famous Tiger tanks, along with a variety of other armored vehicles. By January 1943, the fully restored Leibstandarte numbered nearly 21,000 men, making it one of the most formidable formations in the entire German army. Alongside it in France, the Totenkopf and Das Reich divisions were also being reconstituted along similar lines. Together, the trio would soon be rushed back to the Eastern Front to stabilize the collapsing situation after the disaster at Stalingrad. Deployed to what is now Ukraine, the Leibstandarte fought ferocious battles near Kharkov and Belgorod. In February and March 1943, the Third Battle of Kharkov, helping to restore the front and prepare for the great summer offensive to come. In these operations, the division suffered more than 4,500 killed and wounded. Imagine the thunder of engines rolling across the steppe as Operation Citadel loomed. This was the moment when the Leibstandarte, now outfitted better than ever and clad in the most modern armor available, prepared to hurl itself into battle. Picture it, a force boasting 216 armored vehicles of every type, with 13 Tigers commanding attention like predators among the herd. One of these steel beasts was entrusted for the very first time to Michael Wittmann himself. Can you imagine what he felt gripping those controls? The division advanced toward the city of Prokhorovka, embedded within the Waffen-SS Panzer Corps, and there, on July 12th, it confronted one of the most brutal clashes of the entire operation. After a succession of hard-fought engagements throughout the region, the unit was finally ordered to Italy at the end of July, though only after leaving all of its heavy equipment behind for the Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions. And what awaited the Leibstandarte in Italy? Mussolini had just been deposed, The Allies had already stormed ashore in Sicily, and the threat of invasion hung heavily over the peninsula. Their mission was straightforward, yet tense: occupy part of the country and restore German control. During this assignment, they even found themselves exchanging fire with local partisan groups. By October 1943, the division was rebuilt yet again, this time emerging as a full armored division. Imagine the scale: nearly 20,000 men and more than 200 tanks. Among them, 95 Panzerfus, 96 Panthers, and 27 Tiger tanks. But numbers alone couldn't shield them from what awaited. Within just a few months of defensive combat near the Dnieper River, long before 1944 even began, the Leibstandarte was utterly drained. At one point, it retained scarcely 35 operational panzers. To make matters worse, a portion of its men had to be transferred to the newly created 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, whose ranks were filled with boys aged 17 to 19, guided, in part, by hardened veterans from formations like the Leibstandarte. Yet despite being only a shadow of its former self, the division fought ferociously in early 1944, joining the effort to relieve German forces encircled at Korsun-Cherkasy. By March 1944, its strength had dwindled to just 41 officers, 1,367 non-commissioned officers, and roughly 1,000 soldiers, while its tank count barely exceeded a dozen. This desperate state forced the division to withdraw to Belgium in April, where it was given 2 months to recover before the Normandy front erupted. By the time the Allies landed, the Leibstandarte had once again swelled to about 20,000 troops. But ask yourself, what is a soldier worth without training? These men no longer underwent the strict selection or the extensive preparation their predecessors had known. When the invasion began, much of the division was still deep in a compressed training program, delaying its entry into battle for nearly a month. Only one of its heavy battalions, the 101st, to which Michael Wittmann belonged, was ready for action, diving into combat on June 12th and earning fame in the legendary Battle of Villers-Bocage. Through July, the division fought relentlessly until it was finally encircled in the Falaise pocket, alongside other German formations. To break free, they abandoned almost all of their equipment. By the time the survivors withdrew, only about 6,000 men remained out of the 20,000 who had stood ready a mere 6 weeks earlier. Back in Germany, the division was re-equipped yet again, its losses replenished with priority. Units like the Leibstandarte were always first in line, whether for men or for materiel. Soon after, they were thrust into the Ardennes offensive. But when that final gamble failed, and Allied pressure mounted across every front, the division was rushed to Hungary in early January 1945. There, it fought its last, most desperate battles, striving to hold Budapest and preserve the vital oil fields, the last significant ones still available to Germany. By April 7th, the division had withered once more to no more than 1,500 men, with virtually no armor left. Everything was already lost, yet the unit refused to stop fighting, retreating step by painful step toward Vienna and then into Tyrol. Finally, between May 8th and 9th, the remnants of the division surrendered to American forces at Linz, near the Austrian-German border. And now, we turn to the next formation, another titan of the Waffen-SS, feared across the front, the infamous Das Reich. This was the most decorated unit of them all, claiming an astonishing 69 Knight's Crosses. Close behind followed the Leibstandarte with 58, and the Viking Division with 55. The division we're about to explore played a role in nearly every major campaign of the war: the Battle of France, Operation Barbarossa, Manstein's counteroffensive at Kharkov, the Battle of Kursk, Normandy, the Ardennes, the Lake Balaton offensive, and finally the struggle for Austria. But where did it begin? Its origins trace back to the aftermath of the Polish campaign, when 3 independent Waffen-SS regiments, Germania, Der Führer, and Deutschland, were merged to form a single division. Since these units had fought in Poland, the newly created Verfügungsdivision, as it was initially known, entered existence with battle-tested soldiers and seasoned leadership under Paul Hauser himself. This formation, still not yet bearing the name Das Reich, marched into the Battle of France on May 10, 1940, fighting alongside the Leibstandarte regiment as German forces surged westward. Imagine the scene. The division surges across Holland, pushing relentlessly onward until it reaches Rotterdam on the 12th. Soon after, it remained stationed in the Netherlands, with a new mission suppressing the Allied resistance groups that had entrenched themselves in the Zeeland region. Only when this task is completed, on May 24th, does the formation race to support the German positions established around Dunkirk. There, it is thrown into heavy combat, desperately attempting to halt the Allied evacuation. Yet, despite the ferocity of their efforts, they fail to break the Allied defenses in time. The majority of their opponents manage to escape by sea. Once the fighting around Dunkirk subsides, the unit soon to bear the name Das Reich presses forward again, advancing toward Paris and continuing all the way to the Pyrenees. With the French capitulation at the end of June 1940, the division undergoes several internal changes, among them the replacement of its Germania regiment with a new formation. The original Germania regiment becomes the foundation for the 5th Waffen-SS Division, later known as the Viking Division. Despite these adjustments, the Das Reich Division remains in France, assigned to the planned Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Great Britain, which, as history tells us, never took place. With the cancellation of that operation, the division is transferred to Romania. In the spring of 1941, it participates in the Yugoslav campaign. It is during this campaign that one of the division's earliest and most remarkable triumphs occurs, an act of daring deception carried out by a young officer named Fritz Klingenberg, who manages to seize Belgrade with only 6 men. Imagine that. Entering the capital city and taking control through one of the most audacious deception maneuvers in military history. Afterward, Das Reich prepares to take part in Operation Barbarossa, assigned to Army Group Center. It is on Soviet soil that the division faces its most brutal trials. Fighting through countless engagements around Yelnya and Smolensk, the formation continues toward Moscow. There, during the Soviet counteroffensive in December 1941, it is virtually destroyed. By February 1942, the shattered division must be rushed back to France for rebuilding. At the time of its withdrawal, over 60% of its original strength has been lost, approximately 10,700 soldiers. While being reorganized in France and redesignated as a Panzer Grenadier Division, Das Reich participates in the occupation of Vichy France in November 1942. Later, it is assigned to guard the strategically vital port of Toulon. By 1943, the division has recovered its strength and is urgently dispatched, alongside its sister formations, to the Eastern Front, tasked with helping stabilize the collapsing southern flank after the German disaster at Stalingrad and the relentless Soviet advance. Das Reich becomes one of the first units of the newly created WWII Panzer Corps to reach the area around Kharkov and Belgorod, where it attempts to halt the Red Army. With no time to acclimatize, the division is immediately thrust into action and quickly finds itself overwhelmed by Soviet power. Gradually, it is forced into retreat and comes close to annihilation near Kharkov. Yet on February 20th, 1943, Das Reich joins Manstein's counteroffensive, remaining on the attack for a full month alongside other German formations. With spring approaching, the thaw and mud threatening to bog down movement, both sides pause. the Eastern Front experiences a brief moment of relative calm, a window in which both adversaries reorganize and prepare for the coming storm. Das Reich now positions itself to strike the Kursk salient from the south, acting as a spearhead alongside the Leibstandarte and Totenkopf. In the summer of 1943, the division fields approximately 20,000 troops and 223 armored vehicles, including 14 Tigers and dozens of Stuggy tank destroyers, making it one of the most potent divisions in the Third Reich. At this time, its commander is the well-known General Walter Kruger. The German offensive begins on July 5th. During the first days, Das Reich advances at a promising pace, but gradually the momentum slows until the division becomes bogged down. The period of most intense fighting in the southern sector unfolds between July 10th and 15th, near Prokhorovka. There, Das Reich engages in one of its most violent clashes against the Soviet 5th Guards tank army. The Fremont SS Panzer Corps ultimately prevails, inflicting devastating losses on the Red Army. Yet despite this tactical success, the overall German advance into the Kursk salient grinds to a halt. On July 12th, the Soviets launch attacks against the Oral salient in the north, and by the 17th, they strike in the Donets Basin. The Germans are forced to divert units from the Kursk offensive to defend their flanks. From this point forward, Das Reich becomes locked in a chain of defensive battles along the entire southern sector of the Eastern Front. After months of relentless combat, the division is exhausted and severely depleted. It must be withdrawn once again, this time back to France, to rebuild. Upon its return, the division is redesignated the SS Panzer Division Das Reich rather than a Panzer Grenadier Division. The French city chosen for its reconstruction is Montauban, in the south. There, Das Reich can re-equip, train, and simultaneously protect one of the regions considered vulnerable to an Allied landing, whether on the Atlantic or Mediterranean coast. At any moment, the division must be ready to rush toward the threatened zone. Yet a crucial reality overshadows this rebuilding. By this time, the unit no longer consists of the hardened veterans of earlier years. Most of its troops are inexperienced recruits with minimal training, a consequence of Germany's deteriorating situation. Its armored strength includes 37 Panzer Fuß, 55 Panthers, and 30 Victories. One day after the Normandy landings, Das Reich receives orders to head toward Normandy at maximum speed. The distance from its bases to the front is roughly 700 kilometers. It is here, during this frantic movement, that one of the division's darkest and most infamous episodes unfolds. The origins lie in the sabotage carried out by the British Special Operations Executive, which targets the railways that were meant to transport the division to the Norman beaches. The SOE, working closely with local resistance groups and supported by civilian networks, is responsible for orchestrating covert attacks throughout German-occupied territory. Picture the scene. The rail lines across France lie shattered, twisted by the sabotage of the British Special Operations Executive. Because of this, the transport trains meant for the Das Reich division can no longer move. The division has no alternative but to cross the entire width of France by road, a grueling journey that will sap the strength of its men and grind down its vehicles long before they ever reach Normandy. And as if the punishing miles weren't enough, every forest path and village road hides another threat. French resistance fighters, the resistance spring ambushes, plant traps, and harass the columns non-stop. Imagine driving through narrow rural lanes, never knowing if the next farmhouse or hedgerow conceals an attack. In response, Das Reich unleashes brutal anti-partisan reprisals, which in practice mean massacres of civilians. It is estimated that roughly 1,000 civilians are executed by the division during its march toward Normandy. The ordeal does not end there. Allied aircraft relentlessly strafe the convoy from above, and by the time Das Reich finally reaches the battlefield, its arrival is scattered and delayed, beginning only on June 15th. Although the German High Command had intended for the division to launch a powerful counteroffensive to hurl the Allies back into the sea, Das Reich simply no longer had the strength to do so. Not until July 10th did all elements of the unit finally make it to Normandy far, too late for any grand counterattack. Thus, the division's role became one of desperate defense, holding critical positions on the western sector of the front. There, Das Reich confronted the Americans' right, where the front eventually burst open at the end of July during Operation Cobra. With France lost, the division was withdrawn to Germany in October 1944 to rebuild once again. The next operation it had to prepare for was the German offensive launched in the Ardennes that December, but the Ardennes brought no lasting success. Although Das Reich gained some early advantage and briefly surprised Allied forces, the situation quickly turned against them as the Allies mobilized their overwhelming numbers. After this failed campaign, the division was rushed to Hungary, where Soviet forces had pushed dangerously deep. Das Reich participated in one of the final major German offensives of the war, the Lake Balaton offensive, but was forced back here as well. From there, the division fought a retreat toward Vienna. A smaller group of its troops ended their war in Prague, where they helped evacuate civilians to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. Ultimately, the men of Das Reich surrendered to American forces near the city of Linz, though other smaller elements capitulated elsewhere. Now we turn to the Totenkopf division. At the end of December 1944, after helping halt the Soviet advance toward Warsaw during the summer, Totenkopf and the Viking division were being moved at breakneck speed toward Hungary. As part of the IVSS Panzer Corps, under the command of Otto, Totenkopf was about to enter its final great battles, its last attempt to regain control of Budapest. But before we examine the division's end, let us look back at its beginnings and the combat record of this formation, known as the Skull Division. The Totenkopf Division came into being in October 1939, immediately after the Polish campaign. It initially included around 6,500 SS men who had previously served as guards in German concentration camps. Although these troops had no combat experience, the officers assigned to Totenkopf were veterans of independent SS units that had fought in Poland. After nearly 8 months of formation and training, the division was ready for action in the Battle of France. When the German offensive began on May 10, 1940, Totenkopf was held in reserve. On May 16th, it was deployed to Belgium, assigned to Army Group A, which was executing the dramatic advance through the Ardennes. Its mission: reinforce the progress made by Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, one of the fastest-moving units, racing toward the Atlantic coast. The goal was clear: encircle and cut off the Franco-British forces northeast of the Somme. Totenkopf soon found itself embroiled in multiple fierce engagements triggered by French counterattacks. By May 20th, the division made contact with Rommel near Cambrai after capturing 2 towns southwest of the area, taking 16,000 enemy soldiers. From there, the division pushed toward the Atlantic to help seal off a large portion of the Allied coalition. It fought in the Battle of Arras, where the Allies attempted one final effort to halt the German advance, an attempt that ultimately failed. Once German troops reached the Channel coast, Totenkopf shifted to occupation and security duties near Calais, remaining there until June 7th, when it was moved toward Paris. After crossing the Loire River on June 15th, the division pursued retreating French units into southwestern France. Totenkopf ended this campaign near Bordeaux, close to the Spanish border, by early July. Following this, the division remained stationed in central France until it was once again called to action in April 1941 for new German operations. By mid-June 1941, Totenkopf arrived near Danzig and was assigned to the 4th Panzer Group, which was to spearhead Army Group North's advance toward Leningrad. At this time, the division numbered 17,400 motorized troops. After initial skirmishes along the Soviet border, Totenkopf crossed into Soviet territory on June 24th, its first mission being the elimination of scattered Soviet resistance pockets created during the German breakthrough. Shortly afterward, the division reached the front line and joined breakthrough operations of the 4th Panzer Corps, helping to breach the formidable Stalin Line on July 9th. The penetration of this heavily fortified line came at a terrible cost. The division suffered severe losses, including the wounding of its commander, General Theodor Eicke, who had to leave the Eastern Front temporarily. By approximately July 11th, after crossing the Stalin Line, Totenkopf had already suffered 1,700 casualties, around 10% of its strength. The advance resumed, and by mid-July, the division approached Lake Ilmen, where it fought until August. From there, it moved slightly south to Demyansk, where it would remain for the rest of 1941. The swampy terrain of this region was profoundly unsuitable for a motorized division, and Totenkopf struggled through months of grueling combat. With the Soviet counteroffensives of early 1942, Totenkopf became encircled in what became known as the Demyansk Pocket in January. For 2 months, the division split into 2 battle groups, bore the brunt of the fighting inside the pocket. The only advantage it possessed was better winter equipment than most German units. Totenkopf had received shipments of winter clothing and gear, enabling it to survive temperatures of 30 degrees Celsius. When the Germans finally restored the situation in Demyansk, the scale of the disaster was immense. Of the 93,000 troops originally encircled in February, only 14,000 were still fit for combat by the end of April. Imagine, for a moment, the rumble of engines echoing through the French countryside, dust swirling, tires grinding over endless roads, men exhausted before even reaching the battlefield. This was the grim reality facing the Das Reich division, whose transport trains had been struck, leaving them no option but to traverse the entire breadth of France by road. Can you picture it? A division meant to be a steel hammer arriving instead, like a force bled dry along the way. The delay was disastrous. Not only were the vehicles wearing down and the soldiers pushed to the limits of endurance, but the terrain itself seemed almost to resist them. And then came the ambushes. French resistance fighters, fearless and relentless, struck from forests, farmhouses, and narrow lanes. Booby traps here, a burst of gunfire there. Every kilometer turned into a gamble with death. Faced with this constant harassment, Das Reich launched brutal anti-partisan reprisals, which in practice meant the massacre of civilians. By the time the division reached Normandy, it is estimated that around 1,000 civilians had been executed during their grim journey. Add to this the ceaseless torment of Allied aircraft overhead, and you can imagine the state in which the division finally reached Normandy in pieces, arriving from June 15th onward, far too weakened to perform the powerful counteroffensive originally planned to drive the Allies back into the sea. Only by July 10th had the last elements of the division assembled, and by then all they could do was cling desperately to key defensive positions. Das Reich took up positions on the western sector of Normandy, precisely where the Americans, at the end of July, shattered the German front with Operation Cobra. When France fell, the division had to retreat, returning to Germany in October 1944 to recover and prepare for yet another offensive, the one in the Ardennes, launched in December of the same year. Perhaps you've wondered, what did they hope to achieve by then? Whatever their hopes, they were swiftly dashed. After an initial shock that briefly disoriented their enemies, the Allied response, vast in numbers and unforgiving in force, turned the tables yet again. From there, Das Reich was hurled across Europe at breakneck speed, this time to Hungary, where Soviet advances threatened to overturn the southern flank. Here they took part in one of the last desperate German offensives of the war, the Lake Balaton offensive. And yet, here too, the tide pushed back against them. Forced once more into retreat, the division fell back toward Vienna, while a smaller detachment ended its days defending Prague, helping evacuate civilians who feared falling into Soviet hands. In the end, the remnants of Das Reich surrendered to the Americans near Linz, though scattered groups capitulated elsewhere. Now shift your gaze slightly still in December 1944, still on the Eastern Front. The Totenkopf Division, alongside the Viking Division, was racing toward Hungary. Together, they formed part of the IVSS Panzer Corps, commanded by Otto. Their mission? To prepare for the final great battles of the war battles, aimed at regaining control of Budapest. But before we plunge into that final act, let's take a step back. After all, to understand the end of Totenkopf, we must understand its beginning, its shadowed, infamous origin. The Totenkopf Division emerged in October 1939 in the wake of the Polish campaign, assembled from 6,500 SS men, many of whom had served as guards in concentration camps. These soldiers had no combat experience, yet their officers were hardened veterans drawn from SS units that had fought in Poland. After nearly 8 months of preparation, Totenkopf was ready for war. When the German invasion of France began on May 10, 1940, the division stayed in reserve at first. Only on May 16th was it sent into Belgium, attached to Army Group A, which spearheaded the dramatic advance through the Ardennes. Their task was to support the stunningly fast thrust of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, one of the most rapid-moving formations in the entire campaign. Imagine the chaos of those days, French counterattacks erupting from every direction. Totenkopf fought fiercely, and by May 20th, they linked up with Rommel near Cambrai, having seized several towns southwest of the area and capturing 16,000 enemy prisoners. Pressing onward toward the Atlantic, the division helped close the trap around much of the Franco-British forces, and soon became embroiled in the bloody fighting around Arras, where the Allies made one final attempt to halt the German tide. Once German troops reached the Channel coast, Totenkopf performed security duties near Calais until June 7th, when it was ordered toward Paris. Crossing the Loire River on June 15th, the division then pursued retreating French forces deep into southwestern France, reaching the area around Bordeaux near the Spanish border by early July. From there, Totenkopf remained stationed in central France until being summoned again in April 1941. What awaited them next was something far greater than anything they had yet seen. By mid-June 1941, the division reached the vicinity of Danzig, assigned to the 4th Panzer Group, which was to spearhead Army Group North's advance toward Leningrad. With 17,400 motorized troops, Totenkopf crossed into the Soviet Union on June 24th, tasked with crushing scattered pockets of Soviet resistance. Soon, the division reached the main battlefront, pushing through the heavily fortified Stalin Line by July 9th, though at a horrific cost. During the breakthrough, the division's commander, General Theodor Eicke, was wounded and had to leave the front. By July 11th, Totenkopf had already suffered 1,700 casualties, roughly 10% of its strength. By mid-July, they reached Lake Ilmen, where they fought into August before moving south toward Demyansk, battling relentlessly through the rest of 1941. But the terrain swampy, treacherous, ill-suited for a motorized division, was an enemy in itself. Then came early 1942. The Soviet counteroffensives encircled Totenkopf in the infamous Demyansk pocket. For 2 harrowing months, the division, split into 2 battle groups, endured brutal combat in temperatures plunging below 30 degrees C. Their only advantage was that they had managed to receive proper winter clothing, something many German units desperately lacked. When the pocket was finally relieved, the scale of the disaster became clear. Of 93,000 surrounded German troops, only 14,000 remained fit for battle by April's end. Totenkopf itself had been reduced by 80%, its strength utterly shattered. The division had to be withdrawn to southern France to be rebuilt almost from scratch. This reconstruction transformed Totenkopf into a Panzer Grenadier division, equipped with tanks and mechanized infantry. New recruits began training in fall 1942, though they lacked the extended preparation of the original troops. The goal was clear: to forge a unit capable of rushing to the most critical hotspots of the front and elite fire brigade. But their training was abruptly cut short. The American landings in North Africa Operation Torch forced Germany to occupy Vichy, France. Due to proximity, Totenkopf was among the divisions deployed from November 10, 1942, to carry out this occupation. And then came catastrophe on the Eastern Front. The Soviet counterattack on the flanks of Stalingrad, followed by Operation Saturn, threatened to encircle the entire southern wing of the German army near the Sea of Azov. Desperate, the Germans rushed their strongest reinforcements, including Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, forming the formidable Zenku-SS Panzer Corps. Under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the Corps took part in the bold counteroffensive of March 1943, restoring the Eastern Front. Yet the cost was steep. On February 26th, General Eicke was killed when his reconnaissance plane was shot down. In a striking display of loyalty, his men launched a fierce local attack to retrieve his body, a mission they ultimately accomplished. The next major operation was the massive Operation Citadel at Kursk, the last German attempt to regain the strategic initiative. Totenkopf fielded around 20,000 men and 218 tanks, including 15 Tigers. Beginning on July 5th, the Germans forced their way through layer after layer of Soviet defenses. By July 11th, Totenkopf and the rest of the Ticuan SS Panzer Corps were pushing toward Prokhorovka, unaware of the storm about to break upon them. At dawn on July 12th, the Soviets launched a huge armored counterattack involving 650-700 tanks. Although Leibstandarte and Das Reich bore the brunt, Totenkopf also endured heavy blows, but held its ground fiercely. By day's end, the Germans had destroyed roughly 400 Soviet armored vehicles, losing around 100 panzers, many later repaired. By July 16th, the offensive was called off due to Soviet pressure in the Orel and Donetsk sectors. Of the more than 600 armored vehicles the T-Bauntert SS Panzer Corps had begun with, only 243 remained operational, but their kill ratio exceeded 4:1. After Kursk, Totenkopf shifted south to the Donets, conducting defensive operations through the summer, before withdrawing toward the Dnieper in early October 1943. 3 months of continuous fighting had pushed the division to its limits. On the banks of the Dnieper, west of Poltava, they attempted to halt the Soviet crossing. Through late 1943 and early 1944, Totenkopf defended the front near Kirovograd, where it was again nearly annihilated and had to be pulled back to rebuild once more. In the spring of 1944, the division was sent to Romania, recovering for 3 months. Yet by mid-July, still far from restored and filled with undertrained replacements, Totenkopf was urgently thrown into the central sector to counter the Soviet Operation Bagration, which had obliterated Army Group Center and was driving west from Byelarussia. Forced into retreat, the division fell back toward Warsaw, reaching Radzymin. There, its task was to maintain the defensive line east of the city and join a counterstroke by Walter Model, which succeeded in destroying the Soviet 3rd Tank Corps on the outskirts of Warsaw. But the cost was severe. By September 1944, Totenkopf had to absorb 5,000 replacements, many scarcely trained. Throughout the last months of 1944, now part of the IV-SS Panzer Corps alongside Wiking, the division held the northern sector of the Warsaw Front until December 24th, when it was rushed to Hungary. There, Totenkopf took part in the desperate attempts to relieve Budapest operations Konrad Dapmar, Tekun, and the Three. All failed. The Budapest garrison fell in mid-February. What followed was Germany's final major offensive of the war, Operation Spring Awakening, also known as the Lake Balaton Offensive. Here, the last elite German formations were gathered, in one final effort to destroy the Soviet Third Ukrainian Front, push them east of the Danube, and retake Budapest. But the offensive collapsed. The Soviets counterattacked, driving the Germans back toward Vienna. In Austria and then Czechoslovakia, Totenkopf fought its last battles. Finally, with barely 1,000 men remaining, the division surrendered to the Americans on May 9th. Soon afterward, the Americans handed them over to the Soviets, who demanded custody due to war crimes committed on their territory. And so ends the operational saga of one of the most infamous divisions of World War II. Tell me, after walking through its entire brutal history, what is your impression of this unit?